All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at two things. We're going to be firstly looking at patterns of evolution, and then finally we're going to look at extinction, which, as I've mentioned previously, is, effectively the sort of goal or, the often byproduct of evolution. We have four main patterns of evolution illustrated here. As you can see, divergent and convergent, you are no doubt familiar with from your junior studies in evolution. And then we've also got parallel and co-evolution that we are going to be looking at. So as I said, there are these four different types of evolution, four different patterns. And as we've learned in the past, we know that selection pressures have different effects on different organisms, leading to different types of microevolutionary changes. Those different microevolutionary changes are leading to different speciation patterns, and those different speciation events and patterns are effectively leading to these four overarching patterns of evolution: divergent, convergent, and parallel and coevolution. So divergent evolution is when you've got an original common ancestor and two organisms, two related species have evolved new traits over time, evolving away from that common ancestor. And it has that, distinctive, as we've shown already, that sort of forking pattern where the common ancestor splits into two clear branches. It's when, as I just said, a single species forms two or more species from it, resulting in greater diversity in that lineage, that group of organisms. And often this is also known as adaptive radiation. So we can see an example of divergent evolution here of vertebrates. Starting from a common vertebrate ancestor, we have a divergent that led to sharks, and then it led to a bony skeleton. That bony skeleton ancestor then diverged to form ray-finned fish, and then organisms with four limbs. Four-limbed ancestors diverged to form amphibians, and then organisms with amniotic eggs, and so on and so forth. Constant divergent evolution leading to greater diversity and adaptive radiation. We can look at this in a variety of different scales. We can be looking at, quite closely related organisms, two almost similar species, and look at how they diverge. And if we look at the Galapagos finches, as we so often have, they're a great example of divergent evolution on a small scale. They have a recent common ancestor that they all stemmed from, and they diverged due to different selection pressures from availability of food. So one common ancestor flying around those different islands has given rise to these 9 different species based on the type of food that they eat. If we look a little bit further back in time and look on a slightly bigger scale, though, we look at marsupials. Marsupials are one of the 3 subsets of mammals, the others being placental mammals or eutherians, and also the monotremes. Marsupials all share a common ancestor, hence why they are a group. And that original marsupial ancestor has diverged significantly over time, splitting into the variety of marsupials we have today: koalas, Tasmanian devils, marsupial moles, kangaroos, wallabies. All of those are related, as in they are all marsupials, but they've all diverged away from each other at different times. We've looked at cladograms in the past of this divergence, specifically in marsupials. When we're looking at divergent evolution, one of the main indicators that divergent evolution has occurred are these homologous features or homologous structures, because they show common ancestry. The main example that we're looking at here is the pentadactyl limb. So the pentadactyl limb, you can see there, we've got horses, humans, cats, bats, birds, and whales, all with radically different limb, shapes, structures, functions, but all being based on the same series of bones, all of them being modified. Now, there's absolutely no reason that a horse or a bat with incredibly different functions to their limbs to, say, a human, there's no reason for them to have the same bones, to be made up of the same structures but modified. It would make a lot more sense to have specifically engineered structures. But that's why this is such a good example of divergent evolution, because the only way that those same structures, the homologous features, would have arisen in these radically different limbs is through them having a common ancestor that had those that structure in particular. So what's happened is, as the selection pressures have acted on these organisms, it's resulted in them modifying the structures they already had to suit their environment, make them better, increase their viability in that environment. And so hence we have homologous structures in divergent evolution. And again, going back to the marsupials, we can look at things such as pouches and the way that marsupials develop. So they leave the womb quite prematurely and go into a pouch where they wean there and go on to develop there. Now, that is a very particular trait that is only seen in marsupials. And there's realistically no reason why all of these marsupials would have evolved in that particular way unless they came from a common ancestor that did that. For example, wombats over time have had to actually evolve a backwards facing pouch, because as they dig, they're just throwing dirt on top of their babies if the pouch is facing forwards. And so the pouch system, maybe not necessarily the best thing for them, but they have taken it and they've modified it, and that's an example of divergent evolution. If we have a look here, we've got homologous structures between different groups of cetaceans, dolphins, and whales. You can see that they have very, very similar structures because, well, they serve very similar functions. They share a common ancestor. So we know that they are related. Our other next one that you would have been exposed to before is convergent evolution. Now, diverge means to move apart, converge means to come together. And convergent evolution is where unrelated organisms or distantly related organisms evolve similar adaptations in response to a similar environmental pressure. What that means is the selection pressures acting on these organisms, usually due to being in a similar environment, similar niche, results in them evolving different structures that solve similar problems or solve problems in a similar way. So when we talk about unrelated or distantly related, we know that all living things share a common ancestor if we go far enough back. But we're talking about not related in the most recent future, past, I should say. For example, birds and mammals are both vertebrates, but they do not share a recent common ancestor. We can see here reptile, fish, mammal, bird, all four groups represented in these organisms that are aquatic. They're marine, they're living in a wet environment where they need to be hydrodynamic so they can swim effectively. They need to have flippers that allow them to move effectively. They need to have tails that allow them to steer and stabilize in the water. So this particular streamlined shape is a fantastic example, along with tail fins and flippers, of convergent evolution. Other examples of convergent evolution are these different types of ant-eating organisms. We've got echidnas in Australia, the giant anteater in South America, aardvarks in Africa, and pangolins in Southeast Asia. So all of these organisms have evolved to be quite similar in some ways. They have that sort of tapered head with claws or hooves for digging, and elongated snouts with long tails. And all of these traits allow them to be most efficient at chowing down on ants, which is their main food. So they've all evolved these traits, but in different ways and from different original traits. If you look at an echidna, there's no other marsupial that's anything like it. And so this is a fantastic example of convergent evolution. As we already talked about, dolphins and sharks, great example of convergent evolution. And as we said, they are the result of organisms that are not related or distantly related. Okay, so both sharks and dolphins have shared a common ancestor a long way back, vertebrata ancestor. But divergent evolution split those branches, and then convergent evolution has brought them back together again. Parallel evolution is a bit of a tricky one, and it's definitely a contentious issue around evolutionary biologists, and it's hard sometimes to differentiate between parallel evolution and convergent evolution. So convergent evolution is when two unrelated organisms evolve similar traits but from different origins of those traits. Parallel evolution occurs when descendants evolve similar adaptations to responding in equivalent habitats, the same as convergent evolution, but they do this when they are more closely related descendants. So a great example is parallel evolution of placental mammals over in the Americas and marsupials in Australia. So for many marsupials that we have in Australia, they can find a placental mammal sort of analog or parallel, I suppose. You've got the marsupial mole and the European mole. Now, these guys shared a common mammalian ancestor before branching off to marsupials and placental mammals. So they shared a common mammal ancestor and they diverged at some point. When the continent split, marsupials got stranded in Australia and etc. But what's happened is that after that initial divergence and after diverging for a little while, they have then started to run parallel. So they diverged and split apart in whichever traits they did, but then they've evolved similarly from that point. So the marsupial mole and the European mole diverged when marsupials split from placentals, and they evolved their different traits that delineate them, such as the presence of a pouch versus more prolonged internal development. So they diverged in those respects, but then in terms of evolving claws for digging and being, functionally blind and increased senses of smell and touch, etc., they evolved very similarly. Wombats and woodchucks are another example, and lots of examples there of parallel versus convergent. So another example here is you've got in convergent evolution, you've got a fish that split off a little while ago and then it split again. And then over time, we have two distantly related fish that evolve similar traits. Whereas in parallel evolution, we have a divergence and then whatever those two fish diverged on, one particular trait that they differ on from that divergence there, they've evolved similarly along. And obviously this is a grossly oversimplified example. We're trying to illustrate the difference here because it is quite difficult to grasp. Another example is looking at elephant-like organisms. So many of the elephants, or all of the elephants that we still have today, Asian elephants and African elephants and whatnot, they are all quite closely related and fantastic examples of divergent evolution. So all of their similarities they took from a common ancestor. But if you look at the mastodons in America, they branched off quite a long time ago. And they diverged from the elephant ancestor that then went on to form modern day elephants and woolly mammoths. But what we saw is between mastodons and woolly mammoths, we see a fantastic example of parallel evolution. So they diverged a long, long time ago, but then they evolved some traits similar, or they evolved separately, but in a parallel way, I suppose is the point of this. So just further clarification there, and I'll leave you to read that in your own time. You can pause it if you want. Okay, so convergent evolution are descendants becoming more similar to each other than their ancestors were similar, while parallel evolution means that you've got two organisms with a common ancestor evolving similar traits over time and staying similar. Here we have an example of all three types of those evolution, with some just cat examples here. So divergence over the ear tufts trait, we can see that between F. tuftus and F. griseo. So they diverge from a common ancestor there, and the main split was based on their ear tufts. If we look at convergent evolution in terms of coat color, both P. aliquum, which diverged very early on and split from the grey-coated ancestors. And then later on, we have F. tuftus also evolving this orange coat color. And then you have parallel evolution occurring between F. hispida and F. griseo. So they branched off from a common ancestor a little while ago, splitting based on their tail fluff, and then they've evolved those traits similarly over time. Our last one is coevolution, and coevolution is the evolutionary arms race we've been alluding to so far. It can occur whenever you have organisms with a close relationship, and so the evolution of one influences the evolution of another. So predator-prey relationships are fantastic examples of this. Pollination and symbiotic relationships, for example, competition and mutualism, parasitism, all of these close relationships result in coevolution. So, for example, if a prey species evolves to become faster so that it can survive and escape its predator, then this may select for predators who are slower being selected against. So only the fastest predators will survive. Therefore, the predator population gets faster to catch on their prey, and so they get faster, killing off the slower of the prey, and so on. You've also got the monarch example here, in that birds feed on the mimic butterflies, which look very, very similar to the monarch butterfly. And so the mimic will then, the ones that look closest to the monarch butterflies are going to be surviving there. And the mimic increases the chance that the monarch butterfly will be accidentally eaten, because you've got a bird that's eaten a mimic and has gone, oh, that wasn't too bad, so it might eat a monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly then evolves to look less like the mimic. It's inedible to birds. Birds evolve to then be able to spot the difference between the mimic and the monarch, and so on and so forth. Pollination are fantastic examples of this. So many specialized plants, such as orchids, etc., have evolved specifically to only be pollinized by their chosen host. Lastly, extinction. Extinction is the logical end to evolution, natural selection, because if the environment of an organism changes so much so that it leads to selection and evolution, then the organisms evolve, they diverge, and they become better suited. And if the new organisms are better suited, then that means that the original organism is now unsuitable to the environment. It's then unable to compete and it dies. So this is the reason why some of the stats we've heard before, 95 to 98% of all organisms who ever lived are now extinct, because natural extinction is a result of competition, environmental change, and evolution. So the ancestor becomes inferior, defunct, can't compete, it dies out. So this is one of the problems many people have when they try to understand evolution, because they're looking for these common ancestors constantly as evidence that these processes have occurred. They want to see all the stages of the development of, common current species. But where are they? They're dead. It's as simple as that. So if we look at human evolution here, the common ancestor of humans and great apes as Darwin said so long ago. He never said that we were descended from monkeys. He said that we shared a common ancestor from monkeys. And that common ancestor is now gone because we evolved to be better than it. In the same way, no one is out there producing Blackberries or producing old school phones anymore because we have better phones that everybody wants. They're more able to deal with our modern requirements, and therefore the old phones are defunct. So they've been extinct. So when we look at extinction, there's obviously lots of different causes of extinction, some natural, some not. You can have human-led extinction through hunting and all those other causes as well. But generally, when we've got large populations, they're able to resist extinction because if something comes along, say a disease that kills a lot of them, then because of this large gene pool found in larger populations, they're more diverse. And so that means there's a higher likelihood that they will have a natural mutation that resists whatever that disease is. So it gives them greater variation. It gives them more ammo in their tool belt to be able to draw from. Now, if a population experiences a major catastrophic event, so something comes along that tries to extinct them and they resist that, well, congratulations, those that survived. But we then have a population bottleneck, which we learnt about in terms of our genetic drift and gene flow earlier this term. So the surviving population has lower genetic diversity, and then if they're exposed to a following selection pressure change, then natural selection will act on the fit individuals that are best suited. But if you've got a low genetic diversity after a massive catastrophic event, then it's more likely that some individuals or that more of the individuals are not going to have the right genes. And so the species faces extinction. As you can see by that graph there, after we have a bottleneck event, population size drops dramatically, and so does genetic diversity. Now, over time, naturally, that will hopefully lead to recovery. The population size will increase, genetic diversity will increase. But were another event to occur, it could very well lead to extinction. Great example of this is in the Tassie Devils. They experienced a bottleneck event about, I think it was 9,000 years ago during the last ice age. And that killed off a lot of the Tassie Devils. So only the toughest Tassie Devils survived. And they were the ones that could survive the cold, could survive whatever the conditions were at the time. And then after the ice age was over, we had a smaller population of Tassie Devil. Okay, but they were strong, they were fit. Unfortunately, then came the devil facial tumor disease, which is a very interesting example of an infectious cancer, which we don't see much of. And that started to spread. Now, in a large population, you would be likely to find an individual that has a natural resistance to that due to the genetic diversity of a large population. And so sure, a lot of them might die, but this trait that makes them immune will spread. Now, due to the low genetic diversity of our Tassie Devils, the majority of our populations, almost all of them, show absolutely no resistance to devil facial tumor disease, which means that they all catch it. And as a result, they're all dying from this horrible disease thanks to their low genetic diversity. Now, lucky for them, there's humans that can intervene, so they may not face extinction, but were it a more natural circumstance, this devil facial tumor disease could very well have wiped them out, and it's all due to low genetic diversity. So looking at this graph here, this shows mitochondrial DNA, and looking at the difference in the mitochondrial DNA between different species. Mitochondrial DNA is often used by evolutionary biologists and geneticists, phylogeneticists, etc., as an indication of bottleneck events and of diversity. And if we have a look at this graph here, you can see that the genetic diversity of Tasmanian devil, which is the second from the right there, is very low. Okay, so the genetic diversity of Tassie Devils is incredibly low, and that means that they have gone through a bottleneck at some point. The grey ones here, by the way, are the ones that are extinct. The orange are the ones that are threatened, and the blue are ones that are not considered threatened. So if we have a look at the bison, it has clearly had a bottleneck at some point. Their genetic diversity is quite low at only 15, but their population is quite high. So their population has bounced back. The genetic diversity just hasn't quite gotten there yet. So they're not at risk population-wise, but in terms of genetics, they have very low genetic diversity. If you look all out the top, gorillas have fantastic genetic diversity, fantastic genetic diversity, but population-wise, they are threatened. Similarly, pandas, etc. Okay, this is a demonstration here of all of these organisms that have undergone bottlenecks, and cheetahs are another famous example that have undergone significant bottlenecks and have low genetic diversity. Okay, that's it. We'll look at this more in class, but other than that, that is it for the year. That's a wrap, everyone. Well done. You did it. You learned everything there is to learn in Year 12 biology. Well done.